Entonces estamos desactivando la sala de espera y comenzamos. Yarlet, cuando tú quieras.
Muy bien. Por alguna razón me abrió. Me abre la última. Disculpen. Bien, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Arlet Zulén y soy integrante de la Asociación Latinoamericana de Rehabilitación Neurológica. Para mí es un honor estar presentando, ¿no es cierto?, esta nueva asociación y obviamente invitarlos a que sean parte de ella. Brevemente les voy a contar de qué se trata esta nueva asociación. Bueno, somos una organización multidisciplinaria abierta a todos los profesionales que estén interesados, ¿no es cierto?, en potenciar la neurorehabilitación en Latinoamérica. Como misión tenemos avanzar en el desarrollo y fomentar la calidad de la neurorehabilitación en el mundo, facilitar el intercambio de conocimiento e investigación científica entre todos los profesionales que estén interesados en poder potenciar esta área. A su vez, estimular la colaboración entre los profesionales, ¿cierto? Poder interactuar entre los profesionales de distintos países que estén interesados en la neurorehabilitación. Como visión, es impulsar la conciencia sobre la importancia, ¿no es cierto?, de esta área tan desafiante para todos nosotros, promover la capacitación y la educación continua, sobre todo dentro de los profesionales jóvenes en las distintas áreas de desarrollo, fomentar la investigación y colaboración, y por supuesto, algo muy importante, ser un espacio de comunicación para todos los profesionales afines, ¿ya? Que muchas veces, que cuando estamos desarrollando algo, sentimos que estamos un poco en el aire y que realmente necesitamos vincularnos y potenciarnos entre todos nosotros. Actualmente estamos compuestos por 9 países, hay 67 miembros. Obviamente esperamos que en un corto plazo esto aumente radicalmente y están todos cordialmente invitados a ser parte de esta nueva asociación en neurorehabilitación. Como equipo nos estamos organizando en 3 comisiones con la finalidad de poder desarrollar distintos ámbitos de la neurorehabilitación en Latinoamérica y obviamente en un corto plazo intentar ser un referente, ¿no es cierto?, en nuestras zonas geográficas y también de esta forma poder mostrar al mundo lo que hacemos en Latinoamérica en el ámbito de la neurorehabilitación. ¿Cómo ustedes pueden ingresar a la asociación? Bueno, la idea es que ustedes pueden enviar un correo electrónico que está en pantalla, ¿no es cierto? ¿Y cuáles son los requisitos? Bueno, en primer lugar, lo más importante es tener la disposición para colaborar, ¿no es cierto?, en el intercambio de ideas, en la generación de conocimiento, en lo que se refiere a la rehabilitación neurológica, ser un profesional de la salud que esté trabajando en el área clínica, en el área de investigación, ¿no es cierto?, o también en el área académica, ¿ya? Y actualmente algo muy relevante es que no tiene un costo de membresía, así que quedan todos cordialmente invitados a ser parte de esta Asociación Latinoamericana de Rehabilitación Neurológica. Tenemos distintos eventos que estamos organizando como equipo, pero algo muy relevante para este año es el Congreso Mundial de Neurorehabilitación, que se va a desarrollar en Viena entre el 14 y el 17 de diciembre. Así que están todos cordialmente invitados. Es un evento donde ustedes pueden interactuar y acceder al conocimiento, ¿no es cierto?, más reciente en nuestra área, y obviamente siempre es una gran oportunidad para poder vincularse con distintos profesionales a nivel mundial. Hay ya un link, ¿no es cierto?, al cual ustedes pueden acceder y interiorizarse de lo que es el evento, su programa, los invitados, ¿no es cierto?, y algunos otros detalles. Así que, por favor, los invito a visitar el link de la Federación Mundial. Y por último, los invito a participar, ¿no es cierto?, de nuestro Instagram, del Facebook, y también a comunicarse con nosotros a través de distintos correos electrónicos para quienes quieran tener mayor información y, por supuesto, lo más importante, para quienes quieran ser parte de esta asociación, porque como les dije en un inicio, es una asociación multidisciplinaria y que busca vincularnos, ¿no es cierto?, y permitir que esta asociación crezca a nivel latinoamericano y más adelante podamos ser un referente a nivel mundial. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Arlet. Eh, Ahora vamos a comenzar con la charla de John, ¿cierto? Jorge va a introducir y vamos a comenzar con el sistema de la traducción. Entonces, ustedes verán.
Bueno, ok. ¿Me escuchan?
Sí,
Bien. Quiero darles bienvenida. Estoy muy agradecido con el apoyo de todos en la elaboración de este primer webinar y sobre todo agradecerle a John Krakauer que nos haya permitido el poder escucharlo. Podemos escucharlo en esta reunión. John Krakauer es profesor de neurología, profesor de neurociencias, profesor de rehabilitación. Tiene un grupo de estudio acerca de la recuperación del movimiento, aprendizaje en el movimiento y la reparación a nivel cerebral. Pero por encima de todo, John Krakauer se ha caracterizado por siempre evaluar paradigmas de manejo en la rehabilitación neurológica, buscar romper estos paradigmas para beneficio, cuestionar esto. Esto es algo admirable por parte de John, es algo que es muy loable, muy importante. Y esto lo ha reflejado últimamente en un libro que publicó que se llama The Broken Movement o El Movimiento Roto, en el cual hace una revisión muy profunda acerca de muchos paradigmas de manejo en la rehabilitación. Esto es algo que caracteriza a John y es por esto que yo podría agregar a lo que él agrega o él menciona en su plática, que es repensar muchas cosas. Y John hace esto de una manera frecuente, repensar el manejo de la rehabilitación. Y es por eso que de la importancia de la plática que estoy seguro vamos a poder aprovecharla. Bienvenido, John. Adelante, por favor.
Thank you. Even I could tell how kind that was in Spanish. Hold on a minute. Let me share my screen. Share sound. Can you see this? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be invited. It sounds very exciting, this organization, and I really do hope that I can be invited to visit every country in the organization very soon. Okay. So this is my title, The Need to Think Differently About Recovery After Stroke. And I will try and speak slowly. Put this into play mode. Okay, so this is the lab at Hopkins, the Brain Learning Animation and Movement Lab. All the papers, and most importantly, blog, podcast, and TV appearances are available here. And this is the book that Jorge kindly mentioned, Broken Movement, that I wrote with Tom Carmichael, the chair of neurology at UCLA. And a lot of the details are still, I think, relevant in this book. So I'm going to talk about a few things today, and I'll try and get through in about 30 minutes so we have plenty of time for questions. So this is part one, and I'm going to talk about the hemiparesis phenotype in critical periods. So one of the interesting things about stroke is really it's two diseases in one. It's a motor control disorder and it's a movement disorder. This has been recognized for well over a century. So Hewlings-Jackson basically made the general observation that cortical disease leads to two sets of symptoms, negative from loss of the controlling cortex and positive from the emergence of the lower center. And then FMR Walsh, a neurologist in the mid-20th century at Queen Square in London, also commented on this dual nature of hemiplegia, the combination of loss of voluntary movement and the intrusion of positive phenomena, spasticity and synergy. So the positive symptoms, we'll talk a little bit about. These are these resting postural abnormalities and synergies. And by synergy, this just means unwanted co-activation of muscles or joints. So in other words, you try and extend your elbow and you get flexion of your shoulder and elbow instead. We've all seen this posture of a chronic stroke patient with the depressed shoulder, the internally rotated arm, flexion at the elbow and at the wrist. And of course, this can be very difficult to treat, right? Because there's the initial neural injury and then a lot of peripheral changes, right? Muscle atrophy, joint contracture, tendon shortening, and muscle fibrosis. So it can become very difficult to treat chronic patients. So, you know, the case should be made that we should try and go as early as possible to prevent them reaching this stage. Although, of course, we need to find novel interventions, even for patients who look like this in the chronic state. So one of the first studies to sort of track the natural history of recovery after stroke was Thomas Twitchell, who wrote this classic paper in 1951, where he tracked 25 patients over time, and he characterized their recovery trajectory. So you would imagine the patient is initially plegic, and then there's some flexion at the shoulder, and then some flexion at the elbow at the same time. So there's the flexor synergy, and then perhaps some flexion at the wrist and fingers. So you see that you make a movement and you flex across all three joints. Again, that's the flexor synergy. You know, later another synergy can appear where you get extension across the shoulder and elbow. That's the extensor synergy. And if you're lucky, you can break out of those synergies and begin to move both in extension and flexion. And most importantly, you can flex, for example, at the shoulder and extend at the elbow. And then maybe you can get finger individuation. And the idea is that you want to get as far through this sequence as possible. And indeed, the Fugl-Meyer scale that most people have heard about was simply an attempt to assign a number to how far you got through this sequence. So I've talked about the abnormal posture. I've talked about these abnormal synergies during voluntary movement. Now we can talk about the negative symptoms, the sort of loss of motor control. And one of the ways you can study loss of motor control is using special setups in the laboratory. So for example, we use this one. This is the KinneReach, first designed by Bob Sainberg, you know, and this is a setup that is there to test dexterity, motor control quality in the arm. And the reason it can do that is that the chair is up against your back, so you can't make compensatory trunk movements. The table and the air sled reduce friction and the weight of the arm, so weakness is mitigated. And then you have to make planar movements where the shoulder and elbow are level with each other. The advantage of that is that there's only one joint angle at the elbow and shoulder pairing that gives you a particular position. So basically, if you want to make straight, accurate, fast movements like these on the right, you have to do normal motor control. You can't compensate. So this is like individuation of the arm at the elbow and shoulder rather than the fingers. Okay. And if you look at a patient with stroke, you can see that they have a number of problems. They have curved trajectories, they have high variability, they have reduced accuracy. And of course, what we'd like to do, if we could get true recovery, it would go from the right towards the left. Okay. And you can mathematically quantify the difference, the distance between the trajectories on the right and the trajectories on the left. And for example, here we did that. So on the y-axis is a number, you don't have to worry about it, which captures that difference that you saw visually between the abnormal and the normal. These are normal subjects down here, so you can see how much better they are. This is controls. This is abnormal, so the higher you are, the worse you are. And you can see over the first 4 weeks, you get quite a dramatic improvement, spontaneous biological recovery, but then you plateau. Okay, and you can see there's a lot of white space that you could improve into, but you don't. Right? So in other words, if you take care to assay true motor control, and you subtract out weakness and you prevent compensation, you don't have very long to reverse the deficit. Okay. So I've told you about the abnormal resting posture. I've told you about the synergies that are measured with the Fugl-Meyer, and I've told you about dexterity of trajectory control of the arm. And now we're going to start seeing what the relationship of all these abnormalities between them, what the relationship is. And you should think about hemiparesis after stroke like you think about Parkinson's disease. The three cardinal signs of Parkinson's disease are rigidity, tremor, and bradykinesia, and they all come to varying degrees in any given patient, and they respond differently to interventions. Similarly, there are resting postural abnormalities, spasticity, synergies, weakness, and dexterity abnormalities. And as I will show you, it would be wrong to think that you treat one, you benefit all the others, or that they all come from the same place. They are as different to each other as bradykinesia, tremor, and rigidity. So for example, here you can measure resting postural forces. In other words, this is the two-dimensional version of the patient who you saw in 3 dimensions with the abnormal postures. Here, what you can do is you can use a robot to move the patient passively across the workspace and ask them to relax. And then you can ask them, and you can then measure what their resting postural forces are. Okay. And what's interesting, and this is work by Alkis Hadjoseph, he's just finished his postdoc with us, is that you can see on the left, upper left here, a heat map of flexor forces, that even though the patient is trying to relax, they are making flexor forces on the table surface towards their body. Okay. And you can see that these are much less apparent on the unaffected side. Interestingly, if you give weight support, in other words, you now make them, you help them support the weight of their arm at the shoulder, then those flexor forces, although still present, are reduced. Okay, so when you're having to support the weight of your arm, you have these flexor forces, like that patient in the picture. You then give the support of the table, and you reduce them, although they're still present. Okay. Now, what's interesting is you can take a measure of these forces, and you can see whether their presence at rest predicts the difficulty the patient will have moving across that workspace. You might have predicted that those parts of the workspace where there's a strong resting flexor bias would be difficult to move into on the part of the patient. But interestingly, you see no correlation between the movement abnormality and the resting abnormality. Now, this is very important. This is very much like spasticity. Spasticity, velocity-dependent resistance to passive stretch, is a resting abnormality. And yet we all treat with Botox spasticity, even though as of 2022, there is no evidence that treating spasticity improves voluntary motor control. Similarly, there's no obvious relationship between voluntary motor control across the workspace and the presence of these resting flexor biases. This is similar to the work of Jules de Wolde, who's actually looked also with varying degrees of weight support at the presence of flexor synergies that intrude during movement. So here, without weight support, it's very difficult to extend the elbow, and the patient remains flexed and trapped in this part of the workspace. But as you provide weight support at right angles to the table, the elbow can extend more and more. It's very important to understand that the weight support is not providing assistance to the elbow. Nevertheless, reducing the amount of force the patient has to generate to keep the shoulder up, manages to improve extension at the elbow. This is the voluntary synergy analog of the resting flexor biases I showed you in the previous slide. So what is the relationship between these synergies, these flexor biases during movement and motor control during recovery? Well, here are controls doing the movements, as I said, you can do in that special apparatus. These are patients with chronic stroke with varying Fugl-Meyer scores above. So as you know, the Fugl-Meyer, the higher the score, the better. So this patient has the lowest Fugl-Meyer. This patient has the highest. And then you can look at their trajectory. So you can see that these are abnormal compared to the controls. And you can see that they get better as you look at higher Fugl-Meyer scores. And now we look at patients with acute stroke. So these are patients who've had stroke within 3 months, these are patients after 6 months. And notice that we've matched the Fugl-Meyers. In fact, the Fugl-Meyers are better in each case in the acute state, and yet the trajectories are worse. So you see a dissociation between what the Fugl-Meyer measures and what the apparatus measures in terms of dexterity. So you see this uncoupling between a measure of synergies, the Fugl-Meyer, and a measure of arm motor control. And you can see this in a plot. So you can match the Fugl-Meyer score for the acute patients and the chronic patients. So these are very similar, right? And yet a very big difference in the quality of the trajectories, acutely much worse than chronically. So you see that the negative sign, the motor control deficit, is uncorrelated and dissociates from the positive sign, the Fugl-Meyer. Right? This is important, right? Because you have to decide, well, what's the better outcome measure in a trial? Which one of these two abnormalities should we target? So unless you do this decomposition, it will be no different than saying, I'm going to treat the Parkinson's patient, rather than saying, well, what particular component of their disorder are you targeting? Now, when you do this kind of decomposition that I've described, motor control, strength, synergy, compensation, these components have been studied in rodents and in monkeys and in humans. And then here we're asking, can they be measured and seen? And here, can they be fixed? Interestingly, in the mouse and in the rat, you can get a benefit from training away the motor control deficits. I'll show you some of that myself. You can improve strength. They don't really show synergies. And then we do know that they can compensate. Similarly, in monkey models, the same as in the mouse and the rat, yes, they have motor control deficits and they can be treated. Yes, they get weak and it can be treated and they can compensate. Again, synergies are rarely, if ever, described in monkey models. When you get to humans, you can measure all of these abnormalities, as I've shown you, motor control, strength, synergies, and compensation. What we don't know is whether we can actually treat these impairments in patients. So this is just to give you a little teaser that Stuart Baker, a renowned primate neurophysiologist in England, and I have gotten a grant to try and revisit the mystery of synergies in a monkey model that we're developing. And we hypothesized that one of the reasons why synergies have not been seen in previous monkey models is because the main lesion has been a pyramidal tract lesion. In fact, the term extrapyramidal comes from the mystery in the mid-20th century why pyramidal tracts didn't cause synergies, therefore they must be caused extrapyramidally. So it was, in fact, the term extrapyramidal that is now used for movement disorders actually came from trying to model the synergy movement disorder after stroke. Anyway, what we're trying to do is to create cortical lesions that might actually release synergies after stroke rather than lesioning the pyramidal tract. So here you see the lesion, here's the central sulcus, this is the lesion in front of the central sulcus. And interestingly enough, here's the monkey reaching for pellets on this armature. This is the reach before the lesion, this is the reach after it. You can see that the monkey does really well. You don't see much of a difference. However, if you look at the EMG, you can see that the flexors start to turn on. And the reason why you don't see it is because they also seem to turn on their extensors. Now, as you know, in humans, the extensors are severely affected so that you see more of a deficit. So one reason why, even though the flexors turn on with this lesion, you don't see it in the kinematics is because maybe they have a rubrospinal tract, which is more potent and can counter it, okay? But these are very early days, and we will see. Now to switch to the notion of a critical period, this is Steve Zeiler. He had an NIH mentored award with me. He's now an associate professor and a colleague here at Hopkins. And he and I did some investigations of this critical period idea. In other words, that you're most likely to benefit from training early after a stroke compared to late. Now, this is all predicated on the idea that prehension movements are homologous in the rat or the mouse or the human. This is nice figures from Kolb and Weishaw, scientists in Canada, who have made the case that there is indeed behavioral and neural homology for reaching in the rat and the human. They start, they lift, and they advance. So here you can see it. Oh, that's a shame. Well, this basically, I don't know why that's not working, but the mouse can actually reach out for a pellet and pick it up. You can train them to do that quite well, so they can stop using their tongue. And you can train them to do this. So you first give them a training so they get better, and then you give them a stroke in their motor cortex. This is a coronal section of the mouse brain. And you can inject endothelin-1 and cause a cortical ischemic injury. And then when you do that, here's the mouse being trained to about 60% efficacy on reaching for that pellet and putting it in its mouth. Then you give the stroke. It's much worse. You wait a week. That's like being in the acute stroke unit before you go to rehab. And then you train them, and you can train them for 3 weeks, much more intensely, in fact, than humans get, and you can never get the mouse back to where it was before. Okay. So maybe it was bad that we waited this whole week. So next what we did is we trained them within 1 day. So we started the rehabilitation here, and they were back to normal. So just waiting a week was problematic. All right. Now that's very interesting. Now you can do something quite strange. Let's do this experiment again. Let's wait a week. Again, you can't get them back, even though you train for 3 weeks. And let's give them another stroke. Let's treat this first stroke by giving them a second stroke and doing like we did in the second experiment. We won't wait. Back to normal. So listen to what this means. You gave them a stroke, you trained and trained and trained, and they couldn't get better. You give them another stroke. So they now have a bigger infarct, but you don't wait, and you train, and in 1 week, you can get them back to the way they were before you gave them the stroke. Shocking. What does this mean? It means that there are conditions early after stroke, and they can be reopened later. Of course, we will not give our patients second strokes, but it gives us reason to believe that there may be a way to reopen this window. And it's not non-specific. If you give the lesion somewhere else in the brain that isn't motor, you don't get the benefit. Okay. Very similar results can be obtained in the monkey. So this is a study out of Japan in 2008. I go into great detail about this in the book. Basically, this is looking at monkeys training to remove pellets from food wells. Right? And green, they can't do it. Then they start to compensate in yellow, and pink is when they go back to normal. So pink is if you do it normally. Yellow is if you compensate. And this is a monkey being trained aggressively. And so you notice that it begins by compensating, but then with training, it begins to get more and more pink. And then eventually it's doing everything in pink by 44 days. But remember, this is training the monkey to do it right. This is a monkey that just does whatever it likes over the same time period, and it develops a compensatory strategy. There's a little spontaneous recovery of the pink, but because this is not trained, it disappears and the monkey stays in yellow. So this is what we need to do to humans, and we don't. This is what we currently do to humans. We treat them to compensate. Why do we do that? Well, because you can get them to a superior performance before training to the capacities. Notice this animal is worse than this animal, but it's on the way to being better. You just have to be patient. So this is a very, very important lesson for rehabilitation. Do not train early to function, train to capacity, to normality. Right? And then you can do training to function later. Do not waste the critical period on functional tasks. So this is a kind of heuristic equation that we came up with to try and explain these results in humans and rodents and monkeys, which is if you want true recovery, in other words, pink, not yellow, then you have to train at very high dose and intensity. You have to hope that there is neural representation remaining. In other words, you have brain already dedicated and latent for that capacity. And then you need plasticity, which seems to be higher the earlier you go. So if you go early, plasticity is high, you get more benefit from the training. And if you have like that second stroke, other regions of the brain available, you will recover completely. But you must have residual representation. I won't talk about this today, but there's no such thing as brain reorganization. Okay. What there is upregulation of latent residual circuitry that was always made to do the original function. So part two, what is the therapeutic challenge? Well, it's to try and treat those positive and negative symptoms. Now, we know from a lot of 75 years of research that if you have enriched, playful, emotionally engaging environments with toys and spaces to explore, and you do exercise, and you train at high intensity and high dose, you can get the full recovery that I showed. So how do we combine A and B and C in humans? Okay, because basically in 2022, if you have a stroke, you will get better treatment if you're a rat than if you're a human. All right. Now, I don't have time to go into the details, but we've known for a long time that these fun environments with all sorts of toys and stimulation and lots of behavior have multiple simultaneous, multiplexed, multi-scale effects on the brain. But for some reason, we never decided in rehabilitation to take this path. Okay. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, you have to find a way to train without training on any single task. You need to have people do all the movements that they need outside of a task context. And it turns out that we live in these statistical clouds of everyday life. This is work by Daniel Wolpert and colleagues, and they looked at people over 48 hours, and they found that most of the time our arms and hands live in these sort of elliptical donuts. You can think about it, right? Driving, talking, eating, you live here. So how do we get people to play in this statistical cloud? Right? So what would an enriched environment for patients look like? And how should we promote playful task-based exploratory behavior? Well, Disney was a big clue. We love to watch Disney because we love to see gorgeous movement. That's what animation means. So the trick was to go one step further and have people be the Disney movie. Okay, so this was a trial we did, taking all these clues, go early, go high intensity, high dose, non-task based, enjoyable, etc., etc. Right? And this is me. Basically, the idea was that you would be a dolphin swimming in the ocean. You'd be in a room, the lights would go down, the music would go up. And this is weight supports. In other words, like the table that I showed you before, this is the equivalent in 3D, weight support. No assistance along the direction of movement. This is not assisted robotics. Okay, you have to generate your own movement along the line of action, but you do get varying degrees of weight support. It's like a three-dimensional table. It was a very small study, 20 patients. They had to be within 5 weeks of their stroke. They had to do a lot. You'll see, they had to do 3 weeks, an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. So a very high dose arm training. And there were 3 groups. One group was the dolphin, 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the afternoon. Another group got time on task therapy. Think about it, an hour time on task with a therapist, upper limb only, and then another hour in the afternoon, time on task with a therapist, upper arm only. So many orders of magnitude in both groups more than regular therapy, where the average amount of time spent on the upper limb is about 10 minutes. And then they were assessed at these various time points. And then there was a historical control group that we had a large number of patients who just got regular therapy in the same time windows, okay? This is what it looks like. Oh, I don't know why my videos aren't working, but I don't have that much time, so it's probably good. But basically they see a very gorgeous dolphin, music, and they steer the dolphin and they have to eat the fish, okay? I'll show it to maybe during question time in pure video, we'll see. But basically the idea is you have to steer the dolphin, its nose is your arm's direction, and you make all those movements without realizing in that statistical cloud of everyday movement. Oh, sorry. So what were the results? Well, they were both good and bad. On the left, the ARAT, a measure of negative symptoms like reaching, like in the mouse and rat and monkey, was twice as good in both high intensity groups as many, many different groups getting regular therapy. So in other words, this showed for negative signs, like in the monkey, like in the mouse, that high intensity, high dose is twice as good as regular therapy, okay? Good news. But in this small study, the positive signs, the synergies measured with the Fugl-Meyer, they spontaneously recovered, but we didn't beat spontaneous recovery compared to the regular therapy group. Now, this could be underpowered. There's a much bigger study happening in New Zealand right now, starting much earlier with Winston Biblow and Kathy Stanier, 150 patients. We will see whether we reproduce these results. But it's very exciting that giving a game with a dolphin with weight support immediately was as good as giving many extra hours of regular therapy. So there's a way, I think, of using technology and fun to actually give high intensity, high dose care. So why is it so hard? Well, there's a post-stroke critical period that closes. Arm paralysis is a deficit disorder and a movement disorder, and the synergies are particularly resistant. In the chronic case, we may need other ways to open the window, drugs, neurostimulation, for example, but there may be a subset of patients who are chronic who also benefit just from high intensity, high dose, like we did early. As you can imagine, this is what it requires many, many people. So, you know, the Dolphin trial was done in Switzerland with Andy Luft, at Columbia with Tomoka Katago, with me and Pablo at Hopkins, and Jorn Diedrichsen was involved in some of the measures. He's at Western University in Canada. These are all the funders and many other people involved as well. And I'd like to finish by saying that if you're going to devise beautiful Disney-like experiences that promote enriched plasticity, like in the animal models, then you're going to have in the hospital, not just scientists, clinicians, but you're going to need gamers and artists. So this is the group. This is Omar Ahmad, Pramit Roy, and Jerome Wimberly. These are computer scientists who developed the Dolphin game, and Jerome is an artist. He's done artwork for Star Wars and Marvel and other comics, and he was involved in creating the animation. So if we're going to do new rehabilitation for patients, then you need these kind of people as well as the doctors and the therapists and the scientists. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Jorge?
Sí, thank you, John, for this wonderful presentation. And I know we're going to have learned a lot from this lecture. And now the chat is open for questions. If you want to gather them, please, Pablo. Y quisiera empezar, I would like to ask John, before they start asking questions. I'm going to make the question in Spanish first, John, and then I'm going to make it in English, okay? Sí, entonces lo primero que quiero preguntar es, hay un enunciado muy importante en tu libro que dice que las repeticiones fuertes, las repeticiones altas, repeticiones de movimiento promueven la plasticidad, pero no es lo mismo promover plasticidad que aprender. Y mencionas que aprender depende mucho del reto o de confrontar al paciente con retos para que aprenda. ¿En qué momento empiezas este reto? So one of the statements that I love from your book is that if you do a lot of repetitions, this will promote plasticity, definitely. But your statement says that promoting plasticity doesn't mean that it's a learning process, that you have to challenge the patient to start this learning process. So after doing this gaming with the patient, when do you start challenging him, or am I mistaken or confused with these statements that you put in your book? When did you start to challenge the patient after just doing some function, not challenging, but allowing him to do movement with the Dolphin system?
Well, the Dolphin, yeah, so there are a number of points there. One, the Dolphin game gets more and more difficult, right? So the fish get more intelligent, the sharks begin to attack you. So the skill and the cognition that you need gets more and more difficult. So the challenge is continuous. Okay. Now, what we said in the book is motor learning is not what you need to recover, right? If there's no evidence of a motor learning deficit after stroke. So if all you need to do is learn, 5 years after stroke, everyone should be better. Okay. So what's the problem? If I were to tell you that you're training in the gym and your muscle gets bigger with training, would you say your muscle had learned anything? Of course not. So just because learning requires plasticity doesn't mean that any plastic change means you learnt anything. Okay, it's a logical fallacy to think that because one direction is true, learning requires plasticity, Therefore, if we see evidence of plasticity, you must have learned. So it's a very important thing. Training, like training a muscle, can change the nervous system, but it doesn't mean you learned anything. Regular rehabilitation is based on learning. You learn to compensate and do tricks with what you have left. But if you want to reverse a deficit, you need to train the circuitry on capacities, and then later you can practice using your new abilities. So the motor learning way of thinking is only valuable when you're doing compensatory rehabilitation, not when you're trying to train the nervous system.
So what you're saying is recovery and learning are the same, maybe?
They're not the same.
Okay.
Both rely on plasticity. I mean, spontaneous recovery, right? You see a patient who has a paralyzed hand, and the next day they're beginning to open their hand. They haven't been doing any learning or training. It just happens spontaneously. Right? So in that case, something must have changed in the nervous system, but they haven't learned or trained. Right?
Okay.
So there's spontaneous recovery, there's training that tries to accentuate spontaneous recovery, and then there's learning. And they're all different, even though they all maybe depend on basic plasticity mechanisms.
Let me try to wrap it up and try to translate it, John. Entonces, lo que nos dice John es que efectivamente no hay, si hacemos mucha repetición de algo, haciendo un símil entre el cerebro y un músculo, si uno fortalece el músculo y lo tiene grande, por ejemplo, un bíceps, no quiere decir que va a tener más movimiento o mejor efectividad o más función ese músculo porque está más grueso ese músculo, sino lo que dice John es que tenemos que entender que hay un momento en el que hay una recuperación espontánea en el proceso de recuperación de un paciente que tiene un EBC. Es un momento en el que tenemos una capacidad de recuperar un movimiento que es a través de la compensación, pero el proceso de un paciente que ya tiene mucho tiempo, el tratar de recuperar ese movimiento a través de trucos de compensación es precisamente a través de una compensación. Entonces tenemos que entender la diferencia entre lo que es una recuperación y lo que es un aprendizaje. También lo que le preguntaba yo es en cuanto a aprendizaje y funciones y recuperación, perdón, es que no es lo mismo en este caso, sino que una cosa es recuperar la función, la recuperación, perdón, del movimiento, y otra cosa, una cosa es la recuperación y otra cosa es el aprendizaje. Entonces, el estar haciendo constantemente una recuperación va a permitir que podamos ir teniendo mucha mayor función a lo largo del proceso de recuperación. ¿Hay alguna pregunta, Pablo, en el público? No te escucho, Pablo.
¿Ahí me escuchaba, Jorge?
Sí.
Sí, ya. Yo acabo de escribir una pregunta y Trinidad, Bruna, sí hay preguntas. Hay preguntas.
A ver.
Ahí están en el chat, no sé si la puedes ver.
A ver, voy a ir haciendo una por una.
Sí, Channel creo que es la
Ok,
que...
Chanel. Okay, John, what you mentioned is that we have to train for function. We have to train for function, and
no, we mustn't train for function.
We must. Well, we wasn't train for function, but for the capacity and normality. Could you explain into deep more this term and what you mean by capacity, or if it differs from function?
Right. So one way to think about that is
sí, una forma de pensar de esto.
When you train in a gym to make your muscles stronger with weights, what you're doing is
tratas de fortalecer un músculo con pesas.
But you're not using it in a functional task, right?
Pero no lo usas en una función, en una tarea funcional.
When you go to school and learn algebra and mathematics and grammar, you're learning fundamental capacities that you hope will one day generalize to the rest of life.
Y si vas a la escuela y aprendes álgebra y matemáticas, piensas que en un futuro te va a servir, pero en realidad no sabes si lo vas a usar o no.
So you have to train on the capacities and not on the tasks that one day those capacities will be used for.
Tienes que trabajar sobre las funciones y no sobre las capacidades que a lo mejor en un futuro puedas tú utilizar. Ok.
Sí, hay una pregunta de
There's
Trinidad.
one question about the SMART study. Could you please explain to us why you weren't able to improve in the positive symptoms?
Well, I mean, there are many explanations for that. The positive symptoms
Hay varias explicaciones para esto.
come on over time, and the average time we began was 3 weeks post-stroke. Maybe we should have gone earlier.
Puede ser porque tardamos 3 semanas en iniciarlo, hubiese sido mejor un poco más temprano.
And, you know, maybe this kind of effect isn't sufficient for positive symptoms. My guess is that we will probably see a benefit in both in the larger study.
Probablemente en un futuro se pueda ver un efecto positivo a largo plazo. Entonces, la idea es empezarlo de una manera un poco más temprana. There's another question that says that if you have a patient with not so severe damage, not severe symptoms, the treatment with the video game should be the same if the patient doesn't have the same severe symptoms as a patient that has severe symptoms in the early stage?
I don't think there's any difference between a severe patient that becomes mild and a patient that begins mild.
Creo que no hay ninguna diferencia entre el que tiene pocos daños y daños menos severos y daños más severos.
So I think that everyone would benefit from early treatment focused on impairment and quality of movement and capacity, and then later they can be trained on function. I think
creo que todos pueden aprovechar el trabajo para impulsar sus capacidades y para impulsar su función en un futuro. Entonces no veo ninguna diferencia entre alguna de las dos. ¿Hay más preguntas, Pablo?
No. No hay más preguntas.
Okay, John, I have another question, if I may ask you. Synergies, when you study synergies in papers that refer actually to pathophysiology of synergies, they talk about, like Jules DeWalt did in some papers, of coactivation of muscles. So you consider that it would be good to inject botulinum toxin to therapeutically weakening some of the coactivation muscles and allowed a more improvement in the functional movement and when you, for example, try to inhibit the coactivation of the antagonist muscle that is impeding this movement to have a better movement, let's say, of function. Le pregunto que si está de acuerdo en inyectar toxina botulínica, al estudiar las sinergias puede haber coactivación de músculos parecido al trabajo entre un agonista y un antagonista, y si él considera que podría ser útil inyectar toxina botulínica en el antagonista para facilitar el movimiento en etapas tempranas.
Well, there are many ways to answer that. One is when the muscle you put botulinum toxin in is going to be the agonist and antagonist for other movements that you want to do. So it just seems a bit
Hay varias formas de contestar esto. Puede ser que el músculo que tú inyectas con la toxina puede ser agonista o antagonista dependiendo del movimiento que vaya a estar haciendo en un principio.
So it seems a little strange. And also, you want to practice with the system you have. The problem is that when the Botox wears off, they may come back again because you never tried to control them. They were just switched off. So it's not an approach that I really like. It's too passive. I would prefer to find a way for people to discover ways to control the synergies.
Lo que menciona es que si ponemos la toxina, puede ser que inhibamos ese movimiento en un momento, pero cuando disminuye el efecto de la toxina y desaparece, regresaría el movimiento que estaba de una manera latente o durmiendo y empezaría otra vez a provocar problemas. Creo que no es una estrategia que yo promovería en una etapa de recuperación temprana. Thank you, John. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta?
Sí, hay dos preguntas.
Sí.
Hay una...
Ahí es en inglés, ¿verdad?
Sí, sí.
Okay. John, there's one question.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Why do you choose a dolphin, not an elephant?
First of all, it's an animal that people love, so the answer they gave themselves is true. Also,
es un animal que la gente quiere, que le gusta mucho.
also we wanted an animal that moved continuously. We didn't want an animal that stopped and started.
I lost you at the end.
We wanted an animal.
Pablo, la respuesta, por favor.
We wanted an animal that moved continuously.
¿Quieres un animal que se mueva de manera continua?
Yeah. No stopping and starting.
Ok, muy bien. Thank you. ¿Hay más preguntas, Pablo?
Yeah, I would like to ask you, John, about how do you control the compensatory strategies in the system of the exoskeleton with the dolphin during the training of patients?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there...
Sorry, le pregunté en español cómo controlaban las compensaciones durante el entrenamiento con el exoesqueleto en el sistema con el delfín. Perdón, John.
Yeah, at the moment, we have a therapist coach there. It's like having a tennis lesson, how to hit a good backhand versus a bad backhand. So there's nothing currently in the game or the robot that stops you. So now it turns out that the skill required to play well needs normal like movements. You can't use compensatory movements and do really well. But really, it's like a neurosport with a coach.
Ok, lo que hacen es tener un buen equipo de terapeutas. No hay nada hoy día en los sensores o en el mismo sistema, sino que es el grupo de buenos como coach, como si fuera un entrenamiento del tenis, por ejemplo, con un buen equipo de entrenadores, de alguna forma, lo que controla las compensaciones en los pacientes el día de hoy.
Okay. Other questions, Pablo?
Creo que no hay otras preguntas, Jorge.
So I have just one final question, John. Where is from here? What's your next project? Where's the next step after finishing with the SMART? What are you foreseeing now?
Well, I mean, as I said, we're doing a much bigger version of SMARTs in New Zealand. We've also developed new games for the hand and a new way of doing the hand, because remember, there was no hand here. We have something called the hummingbird for the hand. And we're also developing new creatures for traumatic brain injury and Parkinson's disease. So we're beginning to create a whole zoo for different indications. Yes.
Le pregunté que qué seguía después del SMARTS y me dice que hacer más estudios con el SMARTS en otros países y está desarrollando juegos con animales también para gente que tiene Parkinson y otros padecimientos y que en un futuro vamos a tener todo un zoológico listo para poder ayudar a la gente con problemas neurológicos.
And as I said, and also the hand. I mean, the hand is a huge challenge.
Es que el tema principal en la recuperación es la mano. Perdón, omití esto. Thank you, John. I think that's it. There's another question. I think that would be the last question. Do you think there is a way we can reopen the window for recovery by using botulinum toxin for synergies? ¿Cree que es posible abrir la ventana de oportunidad de periodo de recuperación utilizando toxina botulínica en las sinergias?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think to reopen the critical period, you have to do something to the brain, I think, not peripherally.
Creo que no podemos hacer algo periférico, debemos hacer algo directamente hacia el cerebro, pero no periféricamente hablando.
Yeah.
Ok. Pablo, pues creo que no hay más preguntas. No sé si quisieras hacer un wrap-up, dar las gracias.
Sí. First, I would like to thank John for the time and the amazing talk. And was very, very interesting everything that you comment here, and it's an inspiration for our studies here. And I would like to finish the talk in Spanish to say thank you to the attendees, sorry, and voy a finalizar en español para agradecerle a todos los que se conectaron. El espíritu de los que estamos acá básicamente es contribuir con la Asociación Latinoamericana de Rehabilitación Neurológica y los vamos a estar invitando en el futuro a maravillosas charlas como esta, o, ¿cierto?, de los futuros invitados que la red, ¿cierto?, latinoamericana pueda establecer en el futuro, y esperamos vernos en diferentes instancias como el Congreso Mundial. Así que sin más palabras, quisiera agradecerle a Arlette, a John, a Jorge por su extraordinaria participación el día de hoy, y espero que estén todos muy bien el resto de esta semana. Así que nos vemos en el futuro. Muchas gracias a todos, que estén todos muy bien.
And thank you
Thank you
very
very,
much.
thank you very much.
It was really,
Thank you very much.
it was an honor. Thank you. And lovely to see you both. Bye. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.